Welcome, everyone. Good evening and welcome. The first order of business is we were so hoping that Father Ted Hesburgh could join us tonight, but he is not going out at night anymore, and he sent his regrets and also a message. So,
I believe that one of the greatest things that's happened in the history of Notre Dame is the advent of women as students and women as faculty members and women as trustees of the university. That may not sound like a big thing, but this was a great male bastion, and no one thought it could possibly assimilate women. The fact is that women are, in many ways, a lot smarter than men, and I knew that if I could only get them aboard, they'd make their own way. And so it came that way. And I'm just delighted we have a better university, a better Catholic university, a better modern university today, because we have women as well as men in the mix, and we have women in leadership positions, and we have women with their idealism, and they're very special. This has gone off.
Isn't that wonderful? And thanks to Aunt Therese for facilitating that. So, good evening and welcome. My name is Kathleen Cekanski-Farrand. I'm a faculty member in the Department of American Studies, and I also direct the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism. I'd like to begin by thanking our co-sponsors for tonight at Badin Hall. I understand there are a lot of Badin people here. Wonderful. The Department of American Studies. Yeah, let's give them a round of applause. The Department of American Studies, the Department of History, the Program of Gender Studies. And I'd also like to particularly thank my colleagues at the Cushwa Center, Heather Grennan-Gary and Paula Brock, for all their fantastic work in promoting this event. Thanks especially to all of you for coming tonight and for helping us mark the 40th anniversary of coeducation at Notre Dame. Anniversaries like this one are important to celebrate. First of all, because they provide an opportunity to honor the people on whose shoulders we stand. As a woman who has been at Notre Dame for the better part of 20 years now, unbelievably in some ways, first as a graduate student and now as a faculty member, I really welcome this chance to thank the alumni who truly paved the way for us. But it is particularly as a scholar and as a teacher of American women's history that I want to mark this occasion. I've done a lot of research on women historically in women in Catholic institutions, and that research both inspires me and frustrates me, what I uncover in that research. I marvel at the giant leaps that women have made in the church and beyond, and I'm grateful to the talented and faithful women of the past for what they overcame for the benefit of future generations. But at the same time, I'm often saddened by patterns of gender-based prejudice that persist, by the recalcitrance of some customs and perspectives, and by the limitations and invisibility that women continue to experience at times. So it's in that spirit that I hope we can use this 40th anniversary not only to recognize how much progress has been made, how much progress women have made at Notre Dame in the last 4 decades, but also to envision where we want to be in 40 years from now. And that's why I'm particularly thrilled to see so many undergraduates in the audience. And I asked them to help me in honoring those who confronted more daunting challenges than they could ever imagine. And I also invite them to be part of a future where women are an even more vibrant and influential presence in the Notre Dame family. Women's history changed my life, certainly professionally, but also personally. And that is why I'm so delighted to welcome the first speaker on the panel, the person who introduced me to it. Dr. Susan Poulson is a professor of history at the University of Scranton in Pennsylvania and co-editor of the book Going Coed, Women's Experiences in Formerly Men's Colleges and Universities, 1950 to 2000. She's also wrote an article for the Catholic Historical Review that looks particularly at the transition to coeducation for women at Notre Dame and at Georgetown. When I was an undergraduate history major at the University of Scranton, Dr. Poulson was the only female professor in the department. And I think something we may hear tonight, that one of the challenges from those early days of women being on campus was the fact that there were few role models. And don't get me wrong, I had absolutely wonderful male teachers who mentored and encouraged me, but it was Dr. Poulson who I most wanted to be like when I grew up. Part of this was the fact that she was the only faculty member I knew who was both a professor and a mother, and she was always very honest about the challenges and the blessings inherent in that. I recall one conversation when I was thinking of applying to graduate school, and she shared that one way to pursue tenure and to be a mother was to have all your children in May. And I thought that was a fantastic idea. My 3 children were born in September, October, and March. So I hope that I have been more successful in following Dr. Poulson's example as a teacher than I have been in following her advice on timing pregnancies. And seriously, if my students perceive me to care as much about them as people and as scholars as I perceive Dr. Poulson to care about me and her other students, I will be very happy. Speaking of teachers who continue to inspire me, I'm also delighted to welcome our second panelist, Father Tom Blantz, C.S.C. Father Blantz taught me during my first semester of graduate school here at Notre Dame. His long service to the university has been recognized by many awards, including the 1997 James Armstrong Award for Distinguished Service to the University, the 2001 John A. Canham Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching, and most recently, the Edmund P. Joyce C.S.C. Award for, again, excellence in undergraduate teaching. And he has taught many history majors, undergraduate and graduate, through the ages. Father Blantz received his bachelor's degree from Notre Dame in 1957. His lifelong dedication to the university has taken form in many ways as a member of the teaching faculty in history, as university archivist, and as vice president for student affairs, a position he held during this transition to coeducation. And it was from Father Blantz that I learned, Father Blantz doesn't talk about how much influence he had over the university, but other people, I learned it from other people, so much so that whenever I see that picture of that statue of Father Ted Hesburgh and Father Ned Joyce outside of the library, I always have a mental image of Father Tom Blantz standing right next to them. He was taller than both of them, though. I think that would have to be them. Our third panelist, Therese Darin Palmer, is an attorney and prize-winning writer whose writing has appeared in the Chicago Tribune, Time, and Fortune. That career was launched at Notre Dame, where she was the first woman to serve as a campus news editor for The Observer, and where she received a Sigma Delta Chi Award for her reporting of Notre Dame coeducation. And she put that experience to use, to good use 5 years ago to produce a kind of hardcover thank you note to Father Ted called Thanking Father Ted, 35 Years of Notre Dame Coeducation. And I know many of you have copies of that book. That book contains over 150, I meant to have it. Could you have it? Can we hold it up? Does someone have it? Sorry. It contains over 150 letters of thanks to Father Ted. Therese graduated in 1973, which was the first class to include women for the full academic year. But she's quick to point out that she was not a member of the first co-ed class, and instead she mentions a close friend, Mary Davy Bliley, a marketing major, the only woman to graduate in 1972. So we're actually a year late? No, it's still 2012, so we're good. Okay. Our next panelist, I think I switched the order here, but that's okay. We can. Our next panelist, or the panelist before that, is Kathleen Cekanski-Farrand, who received her law degree from Notre Dame in 1973. Immediately after graduating, she joined the faculty of the law school, where she taught for 5 years. She was rector of Badin Hall in 72-73. The first year it was a women's dorm, and the following year she served as rector in Breen-Phillips Hall. Kathleen also holds the distinction of founding the first all-woman law firm in the state of Indiana, which she did in 1975 with Jean Jordan Swartz. She has served as attorney of the South Bend City Council for 38 years, and I think her leadership in that role exemplifies the best of how the university enriches the local community, so we're thrilled to have her with us. Our next panelist, Janine Sterling, is a member of the class of 76 and is a senior analyst for a global research and consulting firm. As just one of 125 women to enroll in the first co-ed freshman class, she experienced 4 full years as a coeducational pioneer with all the rewards and challenges that entailed. And we'll hear about some of them. Janine remembers what an accomplished group her cohort was. Each of them had done better than 15 other applicants for a place in that class. In a recent interview, she said, "We had been star achievers in high school, and yet to many people, the fact that we were female meant we were lesser in some way. It took me a long time to wrap my head around that and transformed me into a lifelong feminist." Janine currently serves on the steering committee of ND Women Connect, a group that recognizes the special bond shared by Notre Dame alumni and aims to get alumni more involved through mentoring relationships, service projects, retreats, and networking opportunities. And she herself is a member of the Detroit chapter of ND Women Connect. Our final panelist, Dan Reagan, is also a member of the class of 1976, but he only left campus this past March after 28 years as a development officer. He retired as Associate Vice President for University Relations and now runs a fundraising consulting firm, DG Reagan and Associates. His many years on campus have given him a unique perspective on how coeducation at Notre Dame has unfolded, as has his experience as a father to a Notre Dame alumna, Bridget, who graduated in 2000. In an article in the spring 2012 issue of Notre Dame magazine, Dan said his favorite explanation of Notre Dame is to paraphrase a travel guide about Ireland, which describes the country as a beautiful, maddening place that once you visit, you fall in love with it. He says that while Notre Dame's beauty outpaces its frustration, the challenge is always to be cognizant of the maddening side so it does not overtake the beauty. And I think that's a really apt way to approach this discussion of women at Notre Dame over the last 40 years. So again, a warm welcome and a thank you to our panelists and a welcome to all of you. Dr. Poulson will begin with some background information, about coeducation more generally, how that transition was made. And we'll hear from her for a bit longer, and then each subsequent panelist will speak for about 5 minutes from their own perspective of those early years. Please join me in welcoming all of the panelists, and thank you again.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you for that very gracious introduction. And thank you for inviting me to this panel. It's a pleasure to be here. I was here 20 years ago to do some research on the transition to coeducation at Notre Dame, and that's when I first met Father Blantz. And he and everyone here I met was kind, gracious, open, intellectually honest, and cooperative, and it's good to be back. I find the subject of coeducation interesting in part because it reveals so much about a society or a subculture or an institution at a given time. Since it involves the reorganization of men and women, people are often explicit about their views of the proper roles of gender. And because educational institutions are conduits of the past into the future, these revelations show not just what people at the time think about relations between men and women, but also what they think they ought to be. Debates over coeducation, whether a generation or two ago or 150 years ago, reveal the was, the is, and the ought. What I'd like to pass on in this brief history are some general observations. First, that coeducation has often been controversial when it's first begun or considered. Second, the transition to coeducation is often difficult both from an administrative perspective, but especially from a student perspective, from those first students who arrive on campus during the early transition. Third, a generation after the transition, mixing of men and women is usually, but not always, the new norm. Finally, that in adopting coeducation, Catholic higher education has become more like its secular peers. The first experiment in coeducation and higher education in the United States occurred 200 years after the first college in the United States was founded, Harvard, in 1636. Begun in 1833 in the midst of religious revival enthusiasm, Oberlin College was part of the larger plan to bring Christianity to the American frontier. To do so, it not only opened its doors to women, but to African Americans. In its first year, 44 young women enrolled in the female department. There was opposition. Lyman Beecher, the leading Protestant theologian of the era, criticized coeducation. This amalgamation of sexes won't do, he said. If you live in a powder house, you blow up every once in a while. Yet the experiment went well, and after a first few years, the faculty reported that the admission of women had been a, quote, decidedly happy influence in the cultivation of both mind and matters, and that its effect in promoting real virtue and in correcting the irregularities, frivolities, and follies common to youth is unquestionably beneficial. Yet coeducation remained a small portion of American higher education until the federal government passed the Morrill Acts of 1862 and 1890, which led to the establishment of land-grant colleges and universities. As a practical measure, most state institutions opened with women present. There was concern in some places. At the University of Missouri, for example, women were first admitted only to the teaching school as an experiment. Finding that young women at the normal school did no matter of harm, the president reported. We very cautiously admitted them to some of the recitations and lectures at the university itself, providing always that they were to be marched in good order by at least 2 teachers, one in front and the other in the rear of the column as guards. These extraordinary precautions, however, were unusual. Most land-grant institutions opened for men and women without fanfare. The land-grant institutions and the numerous private colleges and universities founded in the Midwest and West in the mid to late 1800s shifted the balance toward coeducation. By 1902, 71% of American institutions were coeducational. At the turn of the 20th century, however, there was a backlash against the mixing of men and women at some institutions. Some feared that if there were too many women on campus and too many women in the liberal arts courses, that institution and those courses would suffer from a stigmatization of being feminine. It would drive away potential male students. When Leland Stanford founded a new university in California, he stated, quote, "The rights of one sex, political or otherwise, are the same as those of the other sex, and this equality of rights ought to be fully recognized." But a few years later, his widow, Jane Stanford, limited the number of women students admitted for fear that the university would be perceived as a women's institution. In 1902, after 10 years of coeducation, trustees of the University of Chicago voted to segregate students by sex in their first 2 years of education there. In 1914, after 40 years of coeducation at Wesleyan University in Connecticut, trustees barred women altogether. This reaction against coeducation was limited to a few institutions. It was the norm in the vast majority of American colleges and universities by the mid-20th century. Yet it's important to note that most of the elite colleges and universities were still single-sex or predominantly male. The Ivy League, for example, or for women, the prestigious Seven Sisters. The single-sex stature was associated with elite status. There's also a geographic feature. Single-sex colleges were disproportionately on the East Coast. Even the publicly funded State University of New Jersey, Rutgers University, had a College of Arts and Sciences that was closed to women until the late 1960s. Catholic institutions have been a unique subsector of American higher education. Today, there are approximately 230 institutions that educate 670,000 students, or approximately 12% of all Catholic college students. While Georgetown was the first university founded by Catholics in the late 18th century, most Catholic institutions were established at the end of the 19th and the first half of the 20th century. In the decade after World War II, Catholics established 25 new colleges and universities. Until the 20th century, however, single-sex education was the norm at Catholic institutions. This reflected the single-sex nature of their founding orders and the traditional visions of proper gender roles in Catholic teaching. Thus, the introduction of coeducation would not only contradict some traditional church teachings, but it would also disrupt established institutional networks. Yet coeducation did come. By 1930, almost half of the Catholic men's colleges and universities admitted women to some portion of their institution, and half of all women in Catholic colleges received their education in coeducational institutions by 1950. There were clerics on both sides of the issue. Bishop John Lancaster Spalding and Boston College President Father Gasson both advocated for the admission of women. A woman, Spalding said in 1905, should be able to be wherever she can, live globally, and do useful work. The career open to ability applies to her no less than to a man. Yet there were many clerics who were strongly opposed to coeducation. If our Catholic women are to retain their sweetness and refinement, they must be educated by women, in schools for women, and along the lines demanded by women's nature. In his 25 years as Jesuit general, Father Vladimir Ledachowski not only denied permission to several universities to become coeducational, but in 1938 ordered that Spring Hill College be closed rather than admit women to stave off bankruptcy. Some of the most vocal resistance to coeducation came from Catholic women's colleges. A poll of presidents of Catholic colleges and universities in the mid-1960s indicated that while the men presidents preferred coeducation by 2-to-1, the women presidents preferred single-sex or coordinate education by 2-to-1. The women presidents rightfully saw coeducation as a threat to their own institution. As one women's college president wrote in 1950, the problem seems basically to devolve upon the old question, what becomes of the women's college? In most cases of mergers, the women's colleges become submerged by the stronger men's institutions. Our college is presently in a crisis. A nearby man's college plans to become coeducational. This means either we join or perish, and yet in the liberal arts department, we are much superior. The women college presidents also questioned whether formerly all-male institutions would do a proper job of educating women. Numerous Catholic colleges and universities did adopt coeducation in the 60s and 70s. Some of them did so for financial reasons. High operating expenses and looming deficits were the primary consideration at Boston College and Georgetown University. But peer influence also mattered. After the Ivy League colleges went coeducational in the 60s, elite status was no longer associated with being single-sex. In fact, it began to be seen as anti-progressive. Administrators at Notre Dame also recognized that coeducation would not only open up a whole other pool of bright students, but attract even more male applicants. Nearly a third of accepted Notre Dame students chose not to enroll in 1968 because of its single-sex status. A poll in the late 1960s indicated that 3/4 of all Notre Dame students considered transferring to a coeducational institution. The fears of the presidents of Catholic women's colleges that coeducation posed an existential threat is borne out in the numbers. In 1960, there were 300 women's colleges, disproportionately Catholic. By 1973, there were 146. Today, there are fewer than 50. As Catholic men's colleges admitted women, they often did so only gradually, in part to acclimate themselves to a new constituency and in part to be mindful of nearby women's colleges. What this meant was that there were fewer positions for the many very talented young women who applied. At Georgetown and Notre Dame, there were 10 women applicants for each position. Admissions had the pick of the lot, and the academic quality of the women admitted was superior to the much larger male student body. This soon showed up in the classroom as many professors expressed their delight in the academic achievement of women students. It also helped women students achieve legitimacy. Yet some women reported hostility in the classroom. Much of it simply depended on the professor. Women students sometimes encountered a male professor who openly expressed doubts about their intellectual capacity or made sexual comments. As late as 1975, women students at Boston College complained of sexist language and persistent objectification of women in the classroom. During this transitional period, there were strains in the campus culture as these institutions adjusted to the presence of women in large numbers. While many people welcomed coeducation, there were others who clearly and sometimes openly resented it. An assistant registrar at Boston College recalled that there were many people, male and female, who hated change, in her words, and looked upon the women as invaders. One of the difficulties of the first women students was social isolation. Traditional dating patterns had usually been between an all-male college and a nearby women's college with formal and informal social gatherings. When the first women arrived at Georgetown, there was some resistance by male students who seemed to prefer single-sex colleges. Women from single-sex colleges. They're not the kind you want to get serious with, one Georgetown male student said, but the kind you see around and really have a ball talking to. Policy changes at the federal level also affected traditional gender norms on campus. In 1973, the Reserve Officer Training Corps opened to women, and the Title IX of the Education Acts of 1972 spurred women's sports. So there was the women's growing presence in these two traditionally male, symbolic masculine activities, soldiering and athletics, further undermined distinctive sexual spheres. Housing often changed dramatically as women became a greater presence on campus. The degree of integration varied, but in what was a literal and symbolic transformation, women's presence usually moved from the periphery to the center. Under student pressure, the in loco parentis system of strict supervision of student morals weakened at most campuses. Men and women students became less isolated from each other, and according to many students, more realistic about each other. At the beginning of the last century, single-sex education was a distinctive feature of American Catholic higher education. This continued throughout the first half of the 20th century, yet as institutions such as Notre Dame opened their doors to women, this particular distinctive feature was lost. In a larger sense, coeducation hastened what has been a long trend in the history of American Catholic experience, acculturation to the broader American society. By eliminating one of its most distinctive features and by liberalizing the regulation of campus life, many Catholic colleges and universities became more like their peers. This period of transition, of negotiating and renegotiating gender norms across campus, in and out of the classroom, was sometimes contentious, often difficult, and especially for the first women students. This was true at Oberlin in 1833, at Tufts in the 1890s, and at Notre Dame in the 1970s. Yet, as time passed, what was once novel became normal. The Boston College administrator, who stated that she and many others saw the first women as invaders, also stated that after a decade, her institution had shed its self-image as a men's college. When I tell my students at the University of Scranton some of the specific details of the way their university was 40 years ago, before women were admitted in 1972, they respond with puzzlement that the arrangements in the very same room where they now sit and the same dorms where they eat and sleep could have been so different. In the minds of many 20-year-olds of today, it was a long ago and far away. Thank you.
As Kathy mentioned, I served as Vice President for Student Affairs here at Notre Dame from 1970 to 1972. Thus, I will simply share some reflections on the background of the decision to admit undergraduate women in that fall of 1972. As I recall the conversations in those years as Vice President, there were several reasons for making the decision to go to coeducation. First, every university continually wants to better itself, and that means attracting better faculty and better students. And Notre Dame was attracting students from only one half of the human race, the males. If Notre Dame were open to women, that would greatly increase the overall pool, and the quality of student body would increase. Second, high schools were changing also. In the past, Notre Dame was attracting many students from single-sex college prep or parish high schools. But parish high schools were now combining into coeducational Central Catholic high schools, and for financial reasons, more students were attending public high schools. After attending coeducational grade school and high school, single-sex Notre Dame might be becoming less and less attractive. Thirdly, women were taking more and more prominent places in business, professions, education, and politics. And if men were going to be working closely with them for the rest of their lives, they should probably prepare for that even in college. Finally, small Catholic women's colleges were having difficulties. Without large graduate programs, it was difficult to attract outside government or foundation funding. Tuition could be raised only so high, and many excellent Catholic women's colleges were forced to close their doors. If Catholic education were to remain available to women, schools like Notre Dame and St. Louis and others should probably open their doors to them. If men and women were to be educated together then at Notre Dame, union with St. Mary's College seemed most logical. A co-exchange program had begun in 1965. A limited number of classes could be taken by students on the opposite campus, and the program seemed to be a success. 200 students were involved that first year, and more than 2,000 in 1971, 850 from St. Mary's and 1,200 from Notre Dame. The two speech and drama departments merged into one. The sociology departments began to make joint appointments. St. Mary's women became Notre Dame cheerleaders, and a shuttle bus service was established. Unification talks continued on the highest level, and on May 15, 1971, the two schools announced jointly that they had agreed to merge by June of 1975, that it would be one coeducational institution by that time. Talks continued throughout the summer, and, as the saying goes, the devil is in the details. More and more difficulties arose, and by mutual agreement, the merger was called off that fall of 1971. For the reasons mentioned earlier, Notre Dame was convinced that men and women should be educated together, and consequently announced that November that it would begin admitting undergraduate women in the fall of 1972, the following fall. The decision was made to admit about 325 women that first year, 125 first-year students and 200 transfer students, and to increase the number gradually each year thereafter. The reason for this was academic. We thought that when we admitted 200 males, they might break about 50 into arts and letters, 50 into science, 50 into business, and 50 into engineering. But women might break differently. Maybe 125 in arts and letters, and only 25 in science, 25 in engineering, 25 in business. Rather than reaching a point where we had to hire additional arts and letters faculty and have perhaps science and engineering faculty with too few to teach, we wanted to move slowly and adjust faculty hiring accordingly, year by year if possible. Residence halls were my major concern, of course. Morrissey Hall might have been able to house the 325 women, since at least some would probably be faculty or staff children and live at home. But I did not want just one woman hall rector or one woman hall president. After much discussion and examination, I chose Walsh and Badin Halls. I selected their first hall staffs. Kathleen Cekanski is the first rector of Badin Hall, and Jane Pitts is the assistant rector of Walsh Hall. And since I had left student affairs late that summer and returned to teaching, I'm anxious now to learn firsthand how it all worked out. Thank you very much.
Good evening. It's a great honor to be here this evening, and I'd like to especially thank all of the sponsors that put this evening together, but especially all the women from Badin, the Bullfrogs, I believe you're called now. I want to give a special shout out to each one of you. I think it's important when we look back 40 years ago that times were totally different. President Nixon was in the White House. He had just won a landslide election against Governor McGovern. Gas was 55 cents a gallon. A postage stamp was 8 cents. And we were only just 2 years removed from the Kent State shootings. That played an important role because I did my undergraduate degree at Ohio State. And I almost didn't graduate because the governor at that time shut down Ohio State when all of the campus rioting began. And I know Notre Dame went through a tremendous time also. But our last year as an undergrad, my memories are walking with National Guard, having tear gas, having buckets of water at all of the residence halls, at all of the libraries, just to wash away the effects of that. So this was the climate that we were working into. And back just 2 years later, I was a third-year law student at Notre Dame, 24 years old, and was honored to be selected by Father Blantz. And if you really want to egg him on, ask him how I was really selected, because I was really a mistake. But a great mistake, in my opinion. In my class at Notre Dame, I was one of 12 women. The class before me had 5. The class before that had 1. So I think part of my selection was because we had some battle scars, and we were able to get through it. As Father Tom mentioned, also on the staff, they wanted someone older and religious. Well, I didn't fit either of those criteria. So they selected Sister Sue Bennett, who was my assistant rector. And then one of my fellow colleagues from law school, a third-year law student who was born in Cuba, Carmen Leon, was one of our RAs. One of the things that we decided, and I'm sure Jane Pitts can talk about this from Walsh, but we decided that we have to roll with the waves, and we're going to be very positive about this transition. We have to be sensitive to the men, and talking with Father Gorski, who was the rector of Howard Hall at that time, we had to be sensitive because we were displacing the men from those dorms. There was a commitment there that the university had made to them, and they thought that that commitment had been broken. So I like to use humor, that we had to build Badin as a family, that we were all in this together. And the ratio, again, Aunt Therese has a better memory perhaps than I do 40 years later, but I thought the ratio back then was about 1 to 17. 1 woman for every 17 males that were on campus. And it became very apparent that the men started learning about what the GPAs were, the women. And there weren't a whole lot of dates at that time because of the intimidation, because of those GPAs. Another common complaint that we dealt with, little things, is that the women's dorms had washers and dryers and the men didn't. I mean, that caused so much tumult that it was just unbelievable. So we decided to start a speaker event at Badin, and we started inviting people, and we started with the first former resident, and that was Father Ted. And that was a night to remember. It truly was. We also invited Father Reilly, who was then the Dean of Students, basically the person that did all the discipline at that point. And then we had a contest about, let's have an identity of our own. Let's have a T-shirt that's truly Badin Hall. Well, believe it or not, I can still get into this T-shirt 20 years later. And that is what we came up with. Well, this same T-shirt we gave to Father Tom, we gave to Father Hesberg, we gave to Father Reilly, and we gave to Father Schultz. Father Tom and Father Schultz were our chaplains in the hall. And that Christmas, all of them wore them. And it was just great. It was just great. The one thing that we talked about during the conversations with our speakers that we had in the dorm were the lack of role models. And I can remember Father Ted saying very vividly, our best role model is at the top of the Golden Dome. And then Father Tom and Father Schultz then incorporated in their sermons at daily Mass a lot about women of the Bible, and especially during the Lenten service. And that really meant a lot. But then finally, I think just because of my nagging perhaps, the university finally eventually invited the only sitting woman in the U.S. Senate at that time, and that was Senator Margaret Chase Smith. And again, that was another totally memorable evening. And the one thing that she talked about, because she was in both the House and also in the Senate, she began her career in 1949. This was 1972. And she said, the one word of advice that I can give to all of you young Coeds is always be a lady. Always be a lady. And I took that advice to heart. I think it's important. I think also it's important to have that positive dialogue. And, we learn from the people that brought us up. My mom was a Rosie the Riveter during World War II in Cleveland, Ohio, while my dad was fighting in Anzio. I mean, we went through a lot of struggles. So the struggles that we had on campus were nothing like the generation before us. I would like to really give a special thanks to the Congregation of Holy Cross, the priests and brothers that worked so hard to make this a success. They took the time, and I really challenge all the women that are co-eds today to talk with people like Father Tom, to take the time to see Father Hesburgh, because you'll regret if you don't take the time to see the models that we were so fortunate to have. It's almost like doing genealogy. You wished you would have asked your grandparents, and then they're gone, and you just don't have that appreciation. People like Father Ned Joyce, Father Jim Schultz, who have passed on, Father Jerry Wilson, who, when the university flew me down to Florida to give an update on coeducation, I mean, what a delightful individual. Father Chambers, Father Brown, Father Toohey. Father Toohey just packed Sacred Heart. Just great. Father Griffin and Darby, his dog. Brother Bookstore, who we call Brother Bookstore, but Brother Moran. Brother Karen Ryan. I mean, just pillars of this university. And I really challenge the women of Badin to learn more about who Father Badin was and how he mentored the Potawatomi Indians. My husband is buried in Cedar Grove, and there's a monument to those Potawatomi Indians over there. There's such a rich history that this university has. And I think not only should we celebrate it today for 40 years, but you should celebrate every single day that you have an opportunity to get a great education at a super university. I am honored and very privileged to be here with you this evening, and I hope I get to meet many of you. Thank you. One thing that I forgot, you all heard about the sign that you had, the welcome sign in the South Dining Hall. Well, Badin Hall also had a sign, and some of you might remember. Many of you may not know who this is, but this is Golda Meir, who was the Prime Minister of Israel. We had a huge sign of her, and underneath it, but can you type? Thank you.
When I was an undergraduate here from 1969 to 1973, the football team was #1 more often than not. In fact, 7 months after I graduated, many of us were in New Orleans at the Sugar Bowl, where we upset Alabama, winning by 1 point and becoming national champions. Now that would be the way to cap off the 40th anniversary of coeducation. But there's another aspect to being one, a single, solitary digit at Notre Dame that I want to talk about tonight. That's as it relates to Notre Dame coeducation. When I was here on campus, one of the most popular songs blaring in and out of all the dorms was Harry Nilsson's One, as in, 1 is the loneliest number you could ever do. Being a co-ed pioneer here was exhilarating, baffling, a thrill-a-minute adventure, but at times, being the single co-ed pioneer was most assuredly the loneliest number you could ever do. Guys, here's your cue. I need 7 guys to come up here and surround me for a minute. Just 7 for right now. The year before, can you get around me? Just 7. The year before Notre Dame went co-ed, the ratio of Notre Dame men to St. Mary's women was 7-1. So will you get around me? Okay, here I am. Go ahead. The one St. Mary's gal with the 7 guys around me. That was daunting enough, as you can see. But 1 year later, with 325 transfer students in Badin and Walsh, plus the 73 girls from my class, in the class of 73 who were grandfathered or grandmothered in, you can take your pick, because our majors were Notre Dame majors and we had to get Notre Dame degrees. We couldn't get St. Mary's degrees. All of a sudden, this 7-to-1 ratio becomes 20-to-1. So may I have a few more men come up so you can see what 20-to-1 actually looks like. Okay, we have 14. We need 6 more. 15, 16. Can we have a couple more?
Dan will come over.
We need a couple more. Okay. Thanks, Father Tom. Okay, so this is 20-to-1, guys. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Here's another example of how goofy things were. The women in my class of 1973 are the recipients of perhaps the most unusual and creative transcripts that Notre Dame has ever issued. For reasons that were never explained to us, technically, we were Notre Dame students for only 19 days. Our transcripts read, transferred in as a transfer student May 1, 1973, graduated May 20, 1973. Not only were we co-ed pioneers, we apparently revolutionized the definition of quick studies. The majority of professors, deans, administrators, and male students were supportive and encouraging. That said, weird things happened. True story. One of my best friends was kicked out of a required class for her government major repeatedly, starting in January when we came back for the spring semester, because the prof said that he never taught a woman and he wasn't about to start. So for 2 weeks, all that Sue did was bounce back and forth like a ping pong ball from her class, which was on the 4th floor of the ad building, over to Dean Waddick's office. And finally, she couldn't do it anymore. And she called her brother, who was at Tulane, and she said, what am I going to do? And he said, so simple. You got to get the top grade on the first quiz. If you do that, he'll shut up, which is exactly what happened. And she ended up with the top grade in the class in the spring. Amazingly, she wasn't the only one of my classmates who experienced this. I circulated my remarks to my classmates a month ago, and I was stunned. We all were stunned at the stories that came back. Being one of 20 fundamentally changed the women that my classmates and I became. Some of the changes were cosmetic, as in clothing. Notre Dame is one of the last places on earth, even today, that could be described as pink, fuzzy, or frilly. One of the most basic ways to fit in around here, as you know, but particularly when you are 1 in 20, was to dress like the guys. Dark colors, jeans, sweats, nothing to stand out. To dress like a woman at any time except on a football weekend was inviting trouble. A sense of humor also went a long way, particularly when you were in a class, the prof said, Mister, and he was talking directly to you. Or he asked for the woman's point of view, looking directly at you. A smile, some harmless flirting, like flirting, was absolutely essential when I wanted to do something that old-timers hadn't gotten the memo that the place had gone, Coed said I couldn't do. Like golfing on the university's golf course, which had been donated with the stipulation women never set foot on it. What really helped us deal with the spasms of loneliness from being the only one on the Pioneer Trail was the immediate open door policy from the beginning on the part of all of the university administrators, including Father Ted, especially Father Tom Blantz, Kathy Cekanski here tonight, the deans, the academic department chairs, even if it meant meeting at night. The door was open if, but especially if there was a problem, but also if you just needed to unwind and talk about the weirdness of your day. And they could get really weird. Such as, what do you say to your closest male friends working with me on The Observer who were staunch supporters of coeducation, editorials on it every day? What happens when their beloved Badin Hall, which is where most of them lived, was one of the first 2 dorms selected for women? These guys were stunned because it meant that a close group of men wouldn't be living together anymore. And to their credit, even though they were heartbroken, after their first appeal went nowhere, they went along with the decision, and the first day that Badin opened in August, the guys were there to help move the girls in and to meet them, which was a real classy thing to do. Or in another class that once again only occurred in my class of 1973, what do you say to the St. Mary's side of your class when you go back to your room at St. Mary's that night after having spent the entire day at Notre Dame in classes? Because only Badin and Walsh were selected to house women, the 73 of us who were getting Notre Dame degrees by agreement with the C.S.Cs and with the nuns across the street were housed at St. Mary's our senior year, which meant that we would take our classes here, we would go home at night. We became a wandering diaspora with the only constant in our life being the shuttle bus. We were ecstatic to be getting Notre Dame degrees, but very mindful of the feelings of the majority of our St. Mary's classmates who were not, many of them still believe to this day, should have been awarded Notre Dame degrees as well. Talk about awkward, that is the definition. As awkward as that was, rivaling it was the competition that developed among the St. Mary's freshmen, sophomores, and juniors, almost all of whom applied to Notre Dame as transfer students. 750 of them applied for the 35 original openings over here, which meant that not only were they all competing against each other, they were also competing against women applicants from other colleges and universities. Business and engineering junior majors from St. Mary's were given preference because they had already completed a part of their major. They were well into them, which reduced the number of openings for everybody else. There were a lot of hard feelings at St. Mary's when those acceptance letters went out. Many friendships that were started at St. Mary's didn't continue once a woman moved across the road. I really wish Notre Dame and St. Mary's had merged, not only for the St. Mary's side of my class, but for everyone. It would have been, and it still would be, a win-win for everyone. I'm still not convinced that a merger won't happen sometime in the future, when there's an entirely new cast of characters with no prior history and no prior prejudices. In hindsight, being a Notre Dame Coed pioneer was the best preparation for something that my classmates and I couldn't have envisioned was going to happen when we graduated. My class became one of the first to benefit from the women's movement. Those of us who went into corporate America after graduation weren't limited to jobs as secretaries or other traditional women's jobs. We were considered for, and in some cases hired into, jobs that only a few years earlier were traditional jobs for men only. And one of the selling points for getting those jobs and getting those interviews was being a co-ed pioneer at Notre Dame. I didn't mind I'd been the only woman in a room. Been there, done that. It taught me how to comport myself in the room, poise, confidence without brashness, ignore the morons, and absolutely make sure you know who won which game the night before so you're readily accepted by the guys. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? It's a real honor to be here tonight and to hear all of these different perspectives. As Kathy mentioned, I'm a proud member of the first class of 125 freshman women and a proud former resident of Badin Hall, room 403. It means a lot to be able to celebrate this milestone at an event that's co-sponsored by my old dorm. I mean, who would have imagined? So thank you. Now, as I mentioned, I'm one of 125 freshman women. There are 125 different stories around the early years experience. I'm sharing part of my story tonight in the belief that many of the themes are ones we all shared to one degree or another. I love my alma mater, but gosh, those first years were challenging. Some people, when they hear that I was one of the pioneers, because we go to different Notre Dame events locally up in Detroit, say, "Oh, you were so brave to do that." Well, no. The brave ones were actually the St. Mary's transfers like AT, who knew exactly what they were getting into and came anyway. The freshmen, most of us were just out and out naive. We were excited, but frankly, we didn't know what we were signing on for. Ignorance was truly bliss at that point. A month or so before classes began, Notre Dame magazine ran an article that interviewed some of the new incoming women. The title was Alice in Irish Land. And honestly, it was a good foreshadowing of what was to come, because once we got there, everybody felt like they had fallen down the rabbit hole. Again, remember, we were very young, so the bombardment of mixed messages the girls received, especially that first year, was really disconcerting. On one hand, we were treated as something very special. I remember CBS cameras trailing around after us during those first few days. Newspapers were interviewing us for articles that ran back home, typically in the women's section of the newspaper. The university hung up that big "We're glad you're here" banner at the welcoming picnic. Life was kind of cool. But then the reporters and the cameras left town, and the banner came down, and reality hit. Suddenly, you're the only girl in a classroom of 30. You have upperclassmen telling you you're not welcome at Notre Dame. You hear that a lot of alumni are angry, really angry. There are guys in South Dining Hall waving scorecards, rating your looks. On that first football Saturday, a crowd of alumni stands silently outside the door to South Quad, watching each of us emerge to go have breakfast. It was like running a gauntlet every day. You feel special, all right, but now it was sort of in a bad way, not a good way. And the poor guys, they don't know how to treat you. Some of the upperclassmen are angry at you because they thought they were attending an all-male school, and surprise, now they weren't. And then there were the flat-out insults because, quote, "if you're smart, you must be ugly." And anyways, quote, "who wants to go out with some girl who's so smart she can get into Notre Dame?" Direct quote. Some even questioned our basic credentials. One upperclassman found out I was a legacy, my dad went here, and said to my face, "Oh, so that's how you got accepted." I told him, yes, I guess it had nothing to do with being a National Merit finalist, a straight-A student, and a Notre Dame scholar. But I think most of the guys were just kind of befuddled as to how to treat us. For many, we were only a potential date or a future mate. It was hard to make real male friends during those first couple of years. Bottom line, as Kathy mentioned, I couldn't believe that so many people were telling me I was lesser, that I didn't belong, just because I was a female. I look at this now and wonder why we didn't pull together more as a group and say, this is unacceptable. Maybe it was the good Catholic schoolgirl syndrome. Don't make waves, don't cause a scene, deal with it. Many women were unhappy that Notre Dame hadn't warned them about what they were getting into, hadn't provided any tools or preparation beforehand. I also take a parent's perspective now and wonder why the university didn't proactively, regularly, take each of us women aside after classes began and say, let's talk. Tell me what you're dealing with out there. In retrospect, I understand it was probably difficult for a basically all-male administration to even recognize the need for that kind of thing. But at the time, I was ready to pack it in after a couple of months, and I applied for sophomore year transfer to one of the other colleges that had accepted me. I just couldn't imagine another 3 years of 20-to-1 ratios and isolation and existing in such an abnormal environment. But then, what happens? You make some new, real female friends. You realize that you have professors you adore and classes that are incredibly interesting and challenging. You become inspired by Father Hesburgh's efforts towards social justice. You fall in love with the campus and the darn ducks down at the lake. And your wise 18-year-old little brain decides that, you know what? To paraphrase a certain marketing campaign, this is worth fighting for. And so each year got a little better. By the fourth year, my senior year, the male-female ratio was down to 4-to-1, and honestly, that felt like normality. It was wonderful. We had our first female band members and yearbook and magazine editors, and members of ROTC, and our first female valedictorian. And the original upperclassmen graduated out, leaving young men who only knew Notre Dame as Coed. And what do you know? We all relaxed a bit, and it was easier to become friends with each other. Now, that's not to say that things didn't stay weird for a long time. Just talk to the 80s and 90s grads. They have their own stories to tell. But only 1 or 2 women ended up dropping out of that first freshman class, my class. 1,600 in all graduated during the 1970s. 1,600. A drop in the bucket, but an important drop. And the one big lesson I took away from my experience here was learning how to persevere when things got tough, hanging in there, making it work, as Father Ted would say. Those early years of coeducation were challenging, joyful, frustrating, crazy, and I thank Susan for helping to put all of that into perspective tonight. So let me wrap with this. I salute my fellow Pioneer alumnae, the graduate women and nuns who came before us during those summer times, and all of the female students who came after us. Notre Dame has been truly enriched by your presence and your energy. Happy anniversary. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Let me get this adjusted a little bit. It's a little intimidating to come last after all that. Let me just tell you that. I deserve that. We all deserve that. I want to thank Kathy for inviting me here this evening. It's a wonderful opportunity to reminisce and reflect on one of the most important periods in the history of the university, a period that certainly set a new and important course for Notre Dame. I told Kathy that I would be honored and privileged to be a part of the panel tonight, but there were many better-suited men from the class of 1976. Fathers John Jenkins and Tim Scully, for example, Athletic Director Jack Swarbrick, Dan Rudinger, yeah, the infamous Rudy, actually. All right, maybe not. But anyway, so I was bragging to my wife about this assignment, and she reminded me that perhaps the university was looking for the average male's perspective. Emphasis on average. So my ego was back in its proper place. The last thing I want to do tonight is bore you with the details of my life, but I feel the need to give you some context in order to reflect on 1972. I'm one of 5 boys, no sisters. My high school, although co-ed, was new and nearly all male. My relationships with women consisted of my wonderful mother and the terrific Franciscan and IH nuns who taught me in grade school and high school. When I was accepted to Notre Dame and was informed that I would be a part of the first coeducational class, I was ecstatic. However, I did not realize that there would only be 125 women in the class. I wasn't great at math, but I could do the odds. I was ecstatic. I was a little worried about my father, however, a 1948 Notre Dame graduate, and how would he take the news of his university about to change in a big way. I should not have worried. He was concerned about some of the traditions being lost, and he was afraid that maybe the admission bar would be raised for his remaining sons. But it swung the door open for his future granddaughters. And I won't say he didn't hear from a few of his classmates that this was a tragic decision that Notre Dame had made. He did, but he was undeterred. So in 1972, the class of 1976 arrived with great enthusiasm and fanfare. As I reflect back on those early years, and at the risk of stereotyping, and it'll bear out what has been said already, so I apologize for the repetition here, but the boys or men of Notre Dame, depending on how you looked at them, seemed to fall into three categories. A percentage who felt that the new women had invaded their space, taken their dorms, ruined some traditions, etc. Probably a little larger percentage that were ready to strut their stuff, so to speak. Impress you, sweep you off your feet, mostly upperclassmen. And a third group that was, for lack of a better term, a bit oblivious, all right? Not that they didn't care, they certainly did. They understood what was going on, but they were a little listless, more concerned about being and just plain being guys, mostly freshmen, all right? One of the great heroes of coeducation was Sister Jean Lenz, at the time rector of Farley Hall in the second year of coeducation. I did not know Sister Jean as an undergraduate. I wish I had, but I got to know her a little during my 28 years of working at Notre Dame. She had a saying which I thought applied to that larger, listless, oblivious group that I described. She would say that students would grow up and grow deep while at Notre Dame. This last group needed every bit of that. We Notre Dame men knew that the Notre Dame women were smarter, I should say, more prepared, definitely more mature. They had already begun to grow up and grow deep. We were a bit intimidated, absolutely. And so what do large groups of intimidated males do? They try to be funny, right? They try to take advantage of larger numbers. They lose sight of decorum. Don't get me wrong, there were plenty of good, respectful, sensitive men at Notre Dame, but the groupthink would definitely take over, especially in those early years. A couple more observations. The women of 1972 were without a doubt pioneers, as they are deservedly called. The tone they established back then continues to pay dividends today, and the women have been exceptional all along the way for 40 years. Time and again, I had the privilege of witnessing this through my work here. Women as speakers, women as ambassadors, women as athletes, women as volunteers, women as leaders, all very impressive. You have changed the place and its people, but maybe in ways you are not aware or maybe just don't think about. That oblivious, listless, immature group of boys eventually did grow up and grow deep. And they graduated, and they married, and they became fathers, and they became fathers of daughters. And I guarantee you that as we raised our daughters, we had you in mind as the role models. Strong, faithful, smart, loyal, because as Sister Jean also used to say, people get you ready for other people. And you did just that. You prepared us to be fathers of the future women of Notre Dame. And you should be thanked for that. One final observation. The university has made such great progress over the years, I can't help but be in awe of Father Ted's vision and the part that coeducation played in that progress. But it's not time to let up. Institutions also need to grow up and grow deep. So Notre Dame needs to continue to be vigilant when it comes to coeducation and its opportunities for women. Still room to grow. Let me close with a quote from Professor Paul Rathburn, now retired, but a longtime arts and letters professor. He was here in 1972 and witnessed the coeducation process. He said just the other day, I was convinced at the time, and still am, that going co-ed was one of the most brilliant moves Notre Dame ever made. The university will never be the same, and I thank God for it. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you. That was really just a great variety of perspectives that I think really gives a good idea, somewhat of idea for those of us who weren't there, what some of the challenges and issues were. So thank you so much. We have time now for questions, and they can be directed to anyone on the panel specifically or more generally. And if you would just, I will repeat the question in the microphone, and I will moderate. And I think that there are microphones there that are working, so you can just answer the questions from the tables. So who would like to go first? Anyone? Yeah.
Did you feel like when you were in the classroom, the professors tailored your education a little differently in comparison to your male counterparts, or were you taught the exact same way?
No, I didn't feel that way at all.
Yeah.
I mean, some of my classes were really large lecture classes, the way that you have with tutorials, but other classes, like I took Father Tom's New Deal seminar, and I think we were, 15, 18 people? No. He treated me like a person to his
Yeah, we had, you would hear stories mostly in the science and engineering department of some of the troubles with some of the professors. But I was in arts and letters, and boy, they accepted us with open arms. And no, they did not re-engineer or retailor, the classroom materials at all for us.
I know I went to a couple of the classes that Emil T. Hoffman had, because those were, everyone was studying on Thursday night for those Friday exams. And then also Father Schultz had a large lecture at Washington Hall, just to, make sure that there was a presence of other people. And then we'd talk after the class, and I think that helped a lot.
And Kathy, if I'm remembering correctly, didn't you go to some of the classes and sit in?
Yes.
Where some of the Badin girls complained
Yes.
that they weren't being treated?
Yes.
Just to sit in the back?
Yes, and I started getting gray hair then.
Okay, please.
How about the complementary issue of bringing more women onto the faculty? You seem to be well positioned to have that aspect of going Coed.
Who wants to handle this one? So you can. Yeah.
There were efforts, and I think one of the issues was that in some fields it was easier to find women than in other fields. And because so many institutions were looking for women scientists with PhDs from top universities all at once, it was sometimes hard for them to find enough candidates. And so there was a lag, and that was one of the issues that I would say stayed around the longest.
Father Blantz, was that part of the conversation in the preparation? Were you part of the conversation for that about hiring more female faculty?
Yes, we had a couple of women on the faculty before that. I think Josephine Ford was here before that, and one of the can't think. And so we started a little bit before that, but yes, certainly we wanted more role models. And as Susan said, it was difficult at times to hire them, or sometimes to retain them. They could get better offers other places at times.
It was
that moved
big,
very slowly, no question about it.
It was a big deal when a woman professor got tenure. It was a big deal. And then I think Isabel Charles was made acting dean of the Arts and Letters College, not dean, but acting dean. But those were big moves.
When I graduated from the law school in '73, in May, I was put on the faculty in August, but it was a non-tenure track faculty for 5 years. And, it was a great experience, but again, it was non-tenure.
Father, did you and the other priests, Father Ned and Father Reilly and many of the priests that were mentioned, did you realize the seriousness of the problem in 72, 73? Or did you just anticipate that as the upperclassmen, as they graduate and you add more female faculty and bring in more women, that the problem is going to resolve itself?
I was in 72, once the women were here, I was just back on the faculty. I wasn't in student affairs or anything like that, so I wasn't involved in, I didn't certainly, you notice in the classroom there's only one or two women in your classes and things like this, and I tried to treat them like everyone else. I did to continue saying Mass either in Badin or Breen-Phillips Hall every night, and so I got to know, quite a few of them that way. But no, I suppose I didn't realize that some of the things that they were going through, I mean, you knew that it was going to have to happen. Let me tell you also that I was also the archivist at this time, and so in 1974 and in 1976, I did some oral history interviews with figuring that someday somebody's going to write a history of the university. And so I did, I think in 74, the first year of women who graduated with 2 years here, asking them about their experience, and the same way in 76. And so certainly I learned a lot about, some of the difficulties of being the only person in the class, and the way some profs were treating them. But I honestly don't remember, my memory's not too good, but I don't remember knowing that or coming across that as a faculty member myself.
However, after some of the masses, we would bring Father into the rector's hall, and we'd have big popcorn parties, and there they were in their pajamas, and he heard about a little bit of this.
True.
Yes. Yeah.
So, as hall staff in the guys dorm, I've heard a lot of the rivals are outdated and are more so now to sort of control the partying, the social scene at Notre Dame, particularly the weekend life. I'm wondering if you guys could share, or anyone on the panel could share, any particular rules, regulations that existed at the very beginning and that maybe we might find a little odd now.
The first thing, well, I have to give you a little bit more of my background. After I graduated, I came back and I got an M.B.A. So I was one of the first hall staff at Farley, the first year they went Coed, the D-Tex cards. Girls' dorms had D-Tex cards, men's dorms didn't. The girls didn't want them. The men couldn't understand why the girls had to have them.
Well, wait a minute.
Explain what a D-Tex is.
We didn't want them until
The
the first
panty
panty
raid,
raid.
the first panty raid.
And then we thank God that we had those D-Tex cards.
Can you explain what a D-Tex card is?
A D-Tex card, and I think now that every dorm has them, a D-Tex
Electronic
card
card.
is an electronic card that you swipe to gain entrance to a building.
If I could just tell a story about that, when Billie Jean King won the tennis match that one night, I was rector at BP.
Yeah.
And after midnight, the gals were coming back, and 38, when it hit 38, and then it hit 49, and then it was about 2 o'clock, and I pulled the fire alarm, and we pulled everyone into chapel. And I said, this is just unacceptable. I know you don't like D-Tex cards, but the university wasn't going to replace them. There was a hassle there. But that was quite a night.
Well, that was scary.
It was.
The guys went crazy. They got into the women's dorms, and they were running up and down the dorms, stealing stuff. I mean, it was really like a mob rule.
And the reflection pool in front of the Hesburgh Library, I mean, people were being dunked in it, and cards were found. Most of the cards were found in the water the next morning.
I could tell you a little bit about some of the regulations at Georgetown. In the 1960s, up until 1968, women students were given a booklet before they came on campus called Miss G Goes to Georgetown. And it was written by the Dean of Women's Office, and it referred to women as the weaker sex.
Oh my God.
In 1968?
Up until 1968, yeah. And it delineated what they were expected to do. They were expected to wear dresses or skirts to class. They were not allowed to wear athletic clothing on campus. If they were on the tennis team, they had to wear a raincoat until they got to the tennis courts. They were not allowed to sit on the grass or sunbathe except up on the roof of the women's dorm. They had daily room checks for cleanliness. Men had none. They had curfews that were a half hour before men. So, for example, if a woman had a 10:30 curfew, the man had an 11. And that was, I think, with the presumption that if they went on a date, he could drop her off and then have time, to get back. If they wanted to go off campus for a night, they had to have written permission from their parents, and the young men did not. Their sexuality was regulated, and male sexuality was not. If there were certain kinds of punishments that women would get, and it would be recorded, on I'm not sure where, but some master record. But the severest sanction was 50 points for public display of affection, and that was defined as prolonged kissing and embracing. So if they were caught with that, they were grounded for the next weekend. And there was no such regulation for male sexuality. So.
I don't know if the halls have security guards now, but we always had a security guard, and the rectors were required to walk floor by floor by floor through that. Betty Reeder, who just recently passed away about a year ago, was ours, and she became a mentor and a psychologist, a shrink, just like I was. And I mean, we'd have popcorn parties till 3 o'clock, and she was a part of that whole crew. And then as noted earlier, we just got settled as Badin people, and then they were going north to have two halls over there, and no one would move. So I said, okay, I'll move if they want me to move. And so I got to go to BP, and so some of the gals from Badin then moved up with us. But I had to take Betty with me, and I had to take Father Blantz with me too, to make it a good transition.
But that's something we didn't really mention at all, was the migratory nature of those first 4 classes of women. You started in Badin and Walsh, then BP and Farley opened up, the next year on North Quad. Well, guess what? Some of you have to go over there, and there were some that did not want to and had to. And then the 3rd year, Lions opens up, same thing. Some of you have to go over here. Don't want to, too bad, you're going. Then 4th year, it was Lewis, same dynamic. They took all of Badin and put us in Lewis, and nobody was happy about that. So, it was very migratory, and it was very difficult for some of the women. You feel so crazy to begin with, dealing with all this, and then you don't even really have a stable home. So there was a lot of different dynamics going on those first 4 years.
I'll just add a little bit to that too. There, for the males as well, in terms of being displaced, but I think it was the 2nd year. This is a little remembered part of the history. They were trying to make more beds available on campus through the dorms, and there just were still too many males. And so in the spring of 74, I think it was, 72, 73, 74, there was Father, I think I have this right, there was an actual lottery that was conducted to require, I think it was 200 males had to move off campus involuntarily. And so I remember it distinctly because I was the first name drawn.
And this was when moving off campus wasn't
not
fun.
cool. Yeah,
it wasn't
cool.
cool. It was dirty. It was unsafe. The landlords were awful. It was not something the guys wanted to do.
And I especially did not want to do it. So we tried to devise a way to stay, so I ran for hall president and won.
Excellent.
And it worked. So I stayed. I was a sophomore.
I just had to laugh when you said that the men were outraged that women had laundry facilities in their basement, because in the 80s we were outraged that the men had St. Michael's laundry.
Exactly.
Yeah, and in the 70s, though, everything that went into the laundry came out mangled. So we were all going, thank God, we don't want to put our stuff in there. And the guys would bribe you so that, they could do their wash and your laundry. Yeah.
And Badin, the first year, had a barber shop just for the men.
That's
Yep.
right.
Yeah.
And the travel
So,
right?
yeah.
We have time for probably one more question. Go ahead.
I am Sister Jean's niece and a recent graduate with an M.A. theology, and I couldn't be more proud to be sitting in this room with all of you. I'm here in her memory just to honor Coeducation and hear all of the stories that she has shared with all of us for all those years growing up. I remember her discernment from being a rector into going into administration. And she took an entire summer to do that and talk to all of us to be an assistant VP in student affairs. But all of those years that she shared with us were so invaluable. And those comments ring true with the family too. To growing up and growing deep, all of that. So thank you.
She was a hero.
Well, I think I'd like to, I know there are some people I know Jane Pitts is here. I know there are many people from those early years. And I wonder if I could just invite the people who were here in the early years, the women who were here in the early years, to stand so that we can recognize and thank them too. Marianne, please. And we'll just end by, again, thanking our panelists for sharing their stories with us and for, for really helping us celebrate all that has been and all that is to come. So thank you.